How do you keep a family alive in a valley where the wind can blow a fire sideways? Why would a sane man dig into a hill instead of raising a cabin like everyone else? And what did he understand about cold that an entire settlement had missed? In the Bitterroot Valley of Montana, in the winter of 1891, men still believed survival looked a certain way. A house stood tall, a roof sat proud against the sky, smoke climbed straight from a chimney, and a man who could raise 4 log walls with his own hands earned respect before he ever spoke. Anything else looked weak. Anything else looked wrong. So when Tomas Varek began cutting into the lower shoulder of a sage-covered slope, instead of stacking logs in the open meadow, the settlement laughed first and judged later. He was not a local. He was a stoneworker from the old country, a quiet man with broad wrists, a slow step, and the habit of touching rock as if it could answer him. He had spent years in quarry pits in western Pennsylvania, after crossing the Atlantic, shaping foundation stone, culverts, feed basins, and retaining walls for rail yards and mills. He understood something most men around him did not. Wood could be warm, but stone and earth could be steady. His first winter in Montana had taught him the difference. The cabin he built that year looked respectable enough. 12-foot walls, a pitched roof, chinking packed hard between the logs, a cast iron stove in the center. On a still day, it almost felt secure. But still days were rare in that valley. Wind came down the mountain corridors with a hard, dry force that seemed to search for weakness. It found every seam. It reached under the door. It slid around the window frame. It slipped through hairline cracks in the chinking, so fine a man could barely see them. But the flame of a lamp could. That was what Tomas watched. Not the frost on the bucket. Not the ice film inside the north wall. Not the way his wife Lenka kept their daughter Marta wrapped in 2 shawls indoors. He watched the lamp flame. Even with the door barred and the shutters fastened, the flame bent and trembled. The house was breathing cold. Warm air rose, escaped, and pulled more cold air after it. The stove glowed red, but the room beyond its small circle stayed cruel. Near the walls, water stiffened in washcloths. Near the floor, his son Pavel woke with numb toes. His neighbors answered winter with more chopping, more hauling, bigger fires, more blankets. Tomas answered it with silence. He studied the problem until it changed shape in his mind. The enemy was not the wall. The enemy was moving air. So in spring, while other men repaired fences and widened sheds, Tomas walked his parcel looking for shelter the way a mason looks for stable footing. At the back of the property he found it. A natural stone bowl tucked into the lee side of a rise, partly ringed by exposed shale and hard-packed earth. It was shallow, but it had shape. It had mass. It had protection. By midsummer he was carving it deeper with a pick, spade, hammer, and pry bar. He cut the floor level. He squared the sides. He saved every usable stone. From the ridge above, men watched him work. Ezra Pike, who hauled freight between the valley settlements, stood with a farmer named Jonas Reed and spat into the dust. "He's building himself a grave," Ezra muttered. Jonas laughed. "No, worse than that. A cellar for sleeping." They called it Varek's pit by the end of August. Tomas heard them. He kept digging. He widened the basin until it could hold a proper room. He shaped the front edge where a wall would stand. Then he dug something stranger still, a long trench on the windward side of the hill, set several feet back from where the buried rear wall would be, narrow and deep like a scar in the ground. That was when the laughter turned to certainty. A roof buried in dirt, a house hidden in a hillside, a trench to stop the wind. Men who had survived blizzards all their lives shook their heads and declared the same thing. The first thaw would flood it. The first heavy snow would crush it. The first real gale would bury his family alive. Tomas did not argue. He just looked at the hill and kept building. Because somewhere between the flicker of a lamp and the howl outside his first cabin, He had come to a conclusion no one else around him was ready to hear. The safest house in that valley might be the one the wind could not find. And by the time winter returned, he would have to prove it. The work that followed did not look heroic from a distance. It looked slow, dirty, humble. That was one reason so many men dismissed it. Frontier people admired what rose fast and visible. They trusted walls they could count, beams they could slap with a palm, and roofs that announced themselves against the sky. Tomas was building the opposite of that. He began with the bowl itself. The back and side walls were not framed in timber at all. They were cut directly into the slope, where layers of compacted soil and weathered stone sat over heavier shale. He trimmed loose sections away and left the dense material intact. In places where the earth looked weak, he set dry-laid stone to brace it. Not decorative stone. Working stone. Wide faces turned inward. Weight set low. Pressure spread out. The only true exterior wall would be the front, facing southeast toward morning light and away from the valley's worst winter blasts. There he stacked the stone he had saved from the excavation. He fitted it by hand, using clay-rich mud and smaller wedge pieces to tighten the face. It was thick enough to carry weight, and low enough to stay partly sheltered by the rise around it. He left space for one heavy door and two small windows no bigger than they needed to be. Every opening in a winter house was a bargain with the cold. Tomas intended to make as few bargains as possible. Lenka asked very few questions. That, more than praise, steadied him. She had lived through the first winter too. She had watched their woodpile shrink like a dying promise. She had wrapped hot stones in cloth for the children and tucked them at their feet. She knew what a proud-looking house was worth when the corners froze anyway. One evening, as the light went copper across the grass, she stood at the edge of the cut and looked down at the room taking shape inside the earth. "It is strange," she said. Tomas rested both hands on the handle of his shovel. "Yes." She looked at the stone front wall, then at the rising lip of the hill behind it. "It is also quiet." That maiden smile for the first time in days. Quiet will save more wood than strength. The hardest problem was the roof. Ezra Pike had already refused to haul the long timbers Tomas first wanted from a mill farther north. "I'll haul lumber for a cabin," he said flatly. "Not for a burrow." So Tomas changed the design. Shorter lodgepole trunks could be cut and dragged from a stand nearer the creek. He felled them himself with help from Jonas Reed's teenage boy, who was paid in coin and curiosity. Tomas laid the poles tight across the span from front wall to rear bearing points cut into the slope. Over them he placed brush, bark, and woven saplings. Over that came packed clay, then a deep layer of sod he had cut intact earlier in the season and kept moist in the shade. When the grass took again, the roof nearly disappeared into the hill. That was the moment the project became offensive to some of the settlers. A bad house could still be respected if it looked familiar. Tomas's house did not. Seen from above, it was a swelling in the land, a grassy back with one stone face and two dark window eyes. It did not challenge the weather. It slipped beneath it. Ezra rode past the day Tomas hung the door. "So that's it," he called out. "You aim to live underground like a badger." Tomas drove an iron pin into the jamb, checked its alignment, and answered without turning. "Only on the cold days. And when the runoff pours down." "It won't." Ezra gave a rough laugh. "Everything runs downhill." "Yes," Tomas said. "That is why I graded it." He had done exactly that. The floor inside sat slightly above a drainage line hidden beneath packed stone and gravel. The ground in front sloped away from the wall, and side channels redirected meltwater around the structure before it could gather. The details were simple. So simple, in fact, that most critics never noticed them. They saw a hole. Tomas saw flow. And the trench behind the house. That drew the most ridicule of all. It ran parallel to the buried rear section, several feet from the structure, deep enough for a man to stand in and lose most of the wind above him. People called it a moat, a grave slot, a fool's ditch. No one understood that Tomas had dug it for air, not water. He had learned from kiln walls and quarry cuts that moving wind behaved differently when forced to leap an interruption in the ground. It lost force. It detached. It left pockets of calm. If the main blast from the northwest could be made to jump over the trench, then the buried roofline and rear mass of the house would sit inside a sheltered zone of still air. No direct attack. No sucking draft. No constant stripping away of heat. By October, the Varek family moved in. The difference announced itself before snow ever fell. Inside the new house, the lamp flame barely moved. Smoke from the stove climbed clean. The air no longer slithered around ankles or crept down from the ceiling. At dusk the walls held warmth instead of shedding it. The packed earth behind them sat near the same temperature day and night, and that steadiness changed everything. The stove no longer had to fight the whole valley. It only had to lift a quiet interior above the earth's baseline. Tomas cut and stacked less wood than his neighbors thought sane. 4 cords, maybe a little more. Men noticed. They joked about it openly. Jonas Reed warned him at the feed store. "You'll be begging by January." Ezra Pike said worse. He claimed he'd someday be forced to dig the family out of their own buried mistake. Tomas listened. Lenka said nothing. The children slept deeper than they had in a year. Then came the first hard freeze. Then the second. And with each colder night, one fact became harder to ignore. The strange house in the hill was staying warm with far less fire than the cabin standing proud above the grass. That was when amusement began to turn into unease. Because if Tomas was right, then everyone else had been losing a battle they did not even understand. By January, the Bitterroot Valley looked forged rather than frozen. Snow had crusted hard under weeks of wind. Fence rails wore white ridges on one side. Creek edges smoked in the mornings. The open cabins across the settlement survived, but none gracefully. Roofs leaked heat by the hour. Doors shrank in their frames. Chinking cracked. Men woke before dawn not because they were rested, but because the fire had gone low and the cold had reached their blankets. The reeds burned through wood so fast Jonas began breaking old wagon boards for kindling. 2 cabins near the cottonwoods developed frost on the inside wall thick enough for children to scratch names into it. One widow moved her bed within arm's reach of the stove and never shifted it back. In weather like that, a home became less a refuge than a machine that constantly threatened to fail. Tomas saw all of it, and still he said little. He hauled water. He split wood. He checked the roofline after every snow. Beneath the sod, the structure held. The buried sidewalls remained firm. The stove in the center room burned low and steady. Lenka baked black bread without taking her gloves off between tasks. Pavel no longer woke crying from the cold. Marta would sit by the small southeast window and draw circles in the faint fog of her breath, then giggle when the warmth of the room erased them again. What amazed Tomas most was not the temperature itself, but the absence of violence. In the old cabin, comfort came in bursts and disappeared in gusts. A fire roared, then a draft stole it. A corner warmed, then turned bitter again. Here the warmth lingered. The walls absorbed it. The air stopped fighting. The room seemed to remember every log the stove had burned. Then the Chinook came. For a day and a half, warm wind rolled over the valley and changed everything. Snow softened on the slopes. Icicles dripped like ticking clocks. Water ran in narrow silver threads across the packed ground. Men relaxed too quickly. They stepped outside coatless. They joked that winter had spent itself. Ezra Pike rode by Tomas's place and slowed his horse at the sight of meltwater coursing around the front channels. "Well," he called, grinning under his scarf, "there's your pond at last." Tomas stood in the doorway and looked at the water sliding exactly where he wanted it to go. "Not today," he said. By nightfall, the temperature broke. Not gradually, brutally. The warm breath of the Chinook vanished as if a door in the sky had slammed shut. Wind returned from the northwest with a hard animal sound, and behind it came a killing drop in temperature. Wet ground flash froze. Runoff locked solid where it lay. Then new snow arrived in wild horizontal sheets, each gust driving crystals across the valley like thrown sand. It was the worst kind of storm. Not the deep, muffling kind. The stripping kind. The kind that found exposed edges and punished them. Jonas Reed's chimney backdrafted and filled his cabin with bitter smoke. A family near the lower road lost half a roof patch when the wind tore at a loosened seam. Ezra Pike spent part of the evening wrestling canvas covers over his freight wagon yard, leaning his whole body into lines that snapped and whipped in the gale. Men shouted to be heard from 10 feet away and still missed half the words. Inside the Varek house, the lamp flame did not flicker. The difference was almost obscene. Linka stitched a tear in Pavel's shirt under steady light, while the stove gave off a patient heat. The buried walls held the warmth in layers. Not hot, not stifling, but livable. Deeply livable. The children slept through the loudest gusts, because the loudest gusts were no longer loud. The storm reached them only as a muted pressure through earth and roof, as if the hill itself had laid a hand over the family and told the night to keep moving. Tomas fed the stove one log and sat listening. There is a strange power in hearing disaster at a distance, when you know it is tearing at others nearby. Relief mixes with guilt. Gratitude mixes with vigilance. He did not trust the calm completely. He checked the door seal twice. He listened for drips. He touched the stone of the front wall. Cool. Stable. He set another kettle near the stove and waited. Out in the storm, Ezra Pike lost a canvas tarp. A gust tore it clean from one wagon and sent it skittering over the frozen ground toward the rise behind Tomas's house. Swearing into the wind, Ezra ran after it. The cold hit his throat like broken glass. Snow lashed his face. He lunged for the tarp where it caught near the hill, then slipped on a glaze of ice and pitched backward into the trench Tomas had dug months before. He expected impact, pain, and then an even worse blast of freezing air funneled down into the cut. Instead, he found stillness. Not perfect silence. The storm still raged overhead, but in that trench, down below the lip of the ground, the wind was simply gone. Snow drifted downward instead of sideways. Ezra pushed himself up on one elbow and stared, stunned. Above him, not 6 feet away, the blizzard streamed past like a white river. Down where he lay, the air rested. He stood slowly. The trench wall beside him was not rimed with savage cold. The buried earth near Tomas's rear structure felt almost neutral through his glove, as if the hill had stored a gentler season inside itself. He took one step, then another, unable to shake the feeling that he had stumbled into the hidden machinery of the house. It wasn't luck. It wasn't stubbornness. It wasn't madness. It was design. And for the first time that winter, Ezra Pike understood that the strangest home in the valley might also be the smartest. But one more proof waited for him around the front. And when he saw it, there would be no way to laugh again. Ezra climbed out of the trench with snow crusted on his coat, and made his way around the shoulder of the hill, one gloved hand trailing along the frozen grass for balance. The wind struck him again the moment he rose above the cut, hard enough to twist his breath and force his head down. That contrast nearly stopped him where he stood. One step below the lip, calm. One step above it, war. He worked toward the front face of the house, and saw a faint amber square through the right-hand window. A lamp. Nothing remarkable in that by itself. Every home in the valley used lamplight, but Ezra had spent enough winter nights in bad structures to know what draft did to flame. In his own bunkhouse, the wick never burned steady during a gale. It leaned, trembled, smoked, recovered, then leaned again. Air announced itself there even when a man could not feel it on his skin. This flame did not move. Ezra stood in the screaming dark and stared through that small pane at a still point of yellow light inside the stone face of the hill. Lenka sat near the table mending. Tomas was at the stove. One of the children turned in sleep on a narrow bed pushed against the wall. No panic, no smoke, no frantic feeding of the fire, no blankets nailed over the door, no man bracing furniture against a shaking frame. Only steadiness. It was such an ordinary scene that it felt miraculous. He did not knock. Pride held him outside. So did something harsher than pride. The sudden understanding that he had mocked a man for seeing the truth first. Ezra Pike, who hauled timbers and freight for a living, who believed any practical thing worth building ought to be obvious on sight, had mistaken familiarity for intelligence. Tomas had not built a weaker house. He had built one that changed the terms of the winter entirely. By dawn the storm had exhausted itself into a pale, bitter morning. Cabins opened one by one. Men stepped out, hollow-eyed and stiff-backed. Someone had spent the night nailing a roof patch down with mittened hands. Someone else had nearly choked on chimney smoke. Jonas Reed's youngest had slept in a chair beside the stove, because the bed alcove turned too cold before midnight. Ezra yoked his team in silence. Then he loaded 2 of the straightest heavy timbers in his yard onto the wagon, and drove them to Tomas Varek's place. Tomas was clearing drift from the front channel with a wide shovel when he heard the wagon stop. He turned, saw the timbers, and then looked at Ezra. For a moment, neither man spoke. Finally, Ezra climbed down, pulled off one glove, and rubbed at his beard as if the words themselves were awkward in his mouth. "I should have hauled for you when you asked." Tomas said nothing. Ezra glanced toward the buried roofline, then away again. "Storm put me in that trench last night." That made Tomas pause. Ezra nodded once, almost resentfully, as though admitting what he had learned still cost him something. "No wind in it. Not a breath." "Then I saw the lamp through your window." He swallowed. "I was wrong about the whole thing." The apology, once spoken, seemed to make the cold air lighter. Tomas set the shovel aside and stepped forward. "You brought the timbers anyway." "To brace the roof better," Ezra said. "If you still want them." Tomas looked at the beams, then at the freighter. "Yes, I do." That might have been the end of it. 2 men, a grudging correction, a practical gift. But frontier knowledge rarely moved through books. It moved through embarrassment, witness, and retelling. Ezra Pike traveled more than anyone else in that valley. He saw outposts, line camps, freight stations, hunting cabins, and ranch houses scattered across country where every winter became a test of fuel, nerve, and luck. And once a man like Ezra changed his mind, people listened. He did not lecture anyone about thermal mass or air infiltration. He had no words for those things. He told the story differently. He said there was a storm that could skin your face raw, and in the middle of it he had fallen into a cut behind Tomas Varek's buried house where the air stood still as a church. He said he'd looked through the window and seen a lamp burning straight while every other flame in the valley fought for its life. That image did the work science could not. By spring, 2 way stations asked Ezra to help them cut wind trenches along the rear of their bunkhouses. A sheep camp north of the river built a half-sunken cook room into a bank and burned noticeably less wood. Jonas Reed, who had laughed from the ridge in August, dug a sheltered storage room into a slope behind his own cabin and admitted, quietly, that potatoes kept better there and did not freeze as fast. Tomas never turned into a local celebrity. That would have embarrassed him more than mockery ever had. But men began to stop by with specific questions. How far back should the trench sit? How deep was deep enough? Which side should face the sun?
How much slope did the drainage need? Could sod hold through heavy snow? Could a roof disappear and still remain sound? He answered each question the same way he had built the house, plainly, without flourish, and only as much as needed. Summer came. The grass on the roof thickened, the hill healed around the shape of the home until travelers sometimes passed without noticing it at all. And yet the house was changing the valley. Because once people understood that winter could be beaten not by fighting harder, but by exposing less, they started to look at the land differently. Not as an enemy to resist. As something that could be used. That realization would matter even more when the next winter arrived, because then the settlers would face a harder question than whether Tomas had been right. They would have to decide whether they were willing to abandon pride, in order to stay warm. The next autumn settled over the Bitterroot Valley, with the slow confidence of a season that knew it would win eventually. Grass yellowed, wheel ruts hardened, woodpiles rose beside cabins like claims of preparedness. But the valley was not quite the same as the year before. Here and there, strange alterations had appeared. A trench along the rear of a line shack. A roof banked deeper with sod than before. A storage room cut into a slope rather than standing free in the open. Small changes, quiet changes, the kind of casual I might miss. The men who made them rarely admitted where the ideas came from. They did not have to. Everyone knew. Tomas noticed the copies and said nothing. He only improved his own house. With Ezra's beams, he strengthened the roof span and redistributed the load where the buried structure met the front wall. He deepened one drainage run before the first freeze, and lined part of it with stone. He added an inner hanging wool curtain behind the door. Not because the house failed without it, but because a wise design invites refinement. By the time snow returned, the Varek home had become what Tomas had imagined from the beginning. Not just a shelter, but a system. The earth on 3 sides held a patient temperature below the frost line. The roof, layered with soil and rooted grass, resisted both cold and wind. The southeast face drank in pale winter light. The trench behind the structure broke the force of the prevailing blasts, and created that mysterious strip of dead air Ezra had felt with his own body. The stove no longer battled 1,000 leaks. It warmed a sealed, quiet volume wrapped in mass. That winter was harsher in its duration than the last, if not as dramatic in its storms. Weeks of bitter weather stretched across the valley, testing woodpiles and tempers. Yet something had changed in the rhythm of fear. Some cabins still suffered badly. Some men still clung to old habits and cursed the cold, as if anger could insulate a wall. But others adapted. They banked snow against exposed foundations. They narrowed openings. They sheltered entrances. They copied the trench. They learned, awkwardly at first, that survival sometimes depends less on building taller than on hiding smarter. One evening in late January, Ezra Pike sat at Tomas's table eating black bread and venison stew, while wind passed harmlessly overhead. It was the first time he had accepted an invitation inside. He looked around the room with an expression that hovered somewhere between respect and disbelief. The lamp burned straight. Lenka hummed softly while mending. Pavel, half asleep, leaned against the wall with a wooden toy horse in his hand. Marta traced the mortar line between 2 stones beside the window, as though it were a secret map. Ezra shook his head. I used to think a house had to stand up to prove something. Tomas sliced another piece of bread. To who? Ezra gave a tired laugh. Other men, mostly. That answer lingered in the room. There finally was the deeper truth beneath all the practical lessons. The settlement had not only misunderstood winter, it had misunderstood pride. Men had built the way they recognized, the way they admired, the way that let them look at a structure and call it strong. But what they called strong was often just exposed. What they called proper was often wasteful. They had been trying to outshout the season with taller walls and bigger fires, while the land itself offered quieter terms. Tomas never framed it like that.
He did not speak in lessons. He simply passed Ezra the bread and said, "The hill does not care what a house looks like." Outside, a gust pressed snow against the front window and moved on. The room barely noticed. In the years that followed, the story of Tomas Varek's buried house spread far beyond the valley. Not as a legend exactly, and not as a miracle. Better than that, it spread as a useful truth. Freight men carried it to mountain camps. Ranch hands repeated it at winter tables. Settlers who could not afford failure listened closely when they heard of a home that stayed warm on less wood because it let earth, grade, and stillness do part of the work. Some copied the design fully. Others borrowed only pieces of it. The trench, the banked wall, the buried storage room, the sod roof over a lean-to kitchen. Few would ever credit Tomas in writing. That was the way of frontier innovation. It disappeared into common sense once enough people saw it work. And maybe that was fitting. Because what Tomas had discovered was not a trick. It was a change in attitude. He looked at wind and refused to challenge it head-on. He looked at the hill and saw not an obstacle, but protection. He understood that the ground itself could become a wall, and that calm was sometimes stronger than force. Long after the laughter faded, that was what remained. Not the mockery. Not the argument. Not even the storm. Just one stubborn man inside a hillside, proving that the homes which endure are not always the ones that stand tallest, but the ones that know how to disappear.